The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, a place where gossip travels as quickly as the gentle breeze, was unusually quiet that morning. Leonard Strickland, a man of few words, had always been the steady presence in the village quiet, reserved and seemingly content with his solitary existence. But today, the stillness of the village carried a weight he could not escape. He stood by his window, staring out at the familiar cobbled streets, his mind drifting over the mundane tasks of the day until the doorbell rang. It was the local constable, his face pale and drawn. "Mr. Strickland, I'm afraid I have some bad news," he began, his voice faltering. Leonard's heart sank before the words even left the constable's lips. "Your mother, Mrs. Strickland, she's been found dead in her home." At first glance, it seemed like any other death in the village. Mrs. Strickland, the once vibrant matriarch of the family, had reached her late 80s, and in a place where time was often measured by seasons, not years. Her passing seemed like a natural part of the rhythm of life. Yet, as Leonard stood there, staring at the constable's face, something gnawed at him. It wasn't the news itself, it was the way it felt wrong. An uneasy weight, like a wrong note in a symphony, hung in the air. He left his home in a daze, his mind clouded with confusion, fear, and a strange sense of dread. As he walked down the cobbled path to his mother's house, every step felt heavier than the last. Upon reaching the doorstep, the air around him seemed different, thicker, more oppressive. The door was slightly ajar, an unusual sight. Mrs. Strickland had always been particular about keeping her house in order, and even more so when it came to locking doors. Inside, the atmosphere was eerily quiet. The grand fireplace in the living room was cold, the hearth untouched. Everything was in its place, yet the silence was unnatural. As Leonard walked further into the house, a chill ran down his spine. The room was impeccably arranged, the way his mother had always liked it. Yet there was something off. A chair was slightly askew, as if someone had just risen from it hastily. A faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air. And then on the table near the window lay a glass of water, still half full, as though Mrs. Strickland had been interrupted before finishing her drink. The moment Leonard stepped into the room, his heart skipped a beat. There, on the floor, beneath the window, lay his mother. Her body, once so full of life, was now cold and still. Her eyes were wide open, but they were not the eyes of a peaceful woman slipping into death's embrace. No, they were filled with an unmistakable fear, as though something or someone had taken her by surprise. Her eyes were wide open, but they were not the eyes of a peaceful woman slipping into death's embrace. No, they were filled with an unmistakable fear, as though something or someone had taken her by surprise. But it wasn't just the fear in her eyes that unsettled Leonard. It was the faintest trace of a smile on her lips, as if she knew something he didn't, something that, even in death, she couldn't take with her. The constable, still standing at the doorway, stepped inside and looked down at the body. He muttered a few words about the cause of death, natural, likely. But Leonard's mind raced. This was not how a death should feel. Not his mother. Not like this. As he stood frozen in place, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door creaking open in the hallway. And then, with the slightest of noises, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Miss Marple, small, sharp-eyed, and with that familiar, unassuming air of quiet authority that only a true detective could possess. She surveyed the room, her gaze flicking from the body to the faintly disturbed chair, to the glass of water, and then back to Leonard. Her expression was calm, unreadable, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She had already seen it, what Leonard was only beginning to realize. Without a word, Miss Marple stepped closer to Mrs. Strickland's body, kneeling down beside her with an ease that came only from years of experience. She studied the scene, her fingers brushing the edge of the chair, and then gliding over the glass of water. She paused, staring at the slightly askew chair for a moment longer than anyone would have expected. Then, she turned her gaze back to Leonard, her eyes sharp and probing. "Mr. Strickland," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of certainty. "I believe we are dealing with more than just a natural death here. Leonard's pulse quickened as Miss Marple's words hung in the air, a quiet challenge to the simple explanation everyone had expected. What had truly happened in this room? Who had been involved? And why did Leonard feel as though he was standing on the edge of something much darker than he had ever imagined? Before Leonard could speak, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the faintest of details. The window was open just a crack, allowing a small breeze to stir the curtains. The subtle movement felt deliberate. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew. This was not the work of chance. This was something more deliberate, something carefully orchestrated. The door closed softly behind them, and the weight of the mystery settled over the room like a heavy fog. Cliffhanger ending. Just as Miss Marple began to move closer to a cluttered desk in the corner of the room, a sudden noise echoed from upstairs, a sharp thud, like something heavy falling. Miss Marple froze, her keen eyes narrowing. Without a word, she turned to Leonard, a look of quiet urgency flashing in her gaze. "Stay here," she instructed, her voice low but firm. Leonard nodded, but his heart raced as she moved swiftly toward the stairs. A cold, unsettling silence filled the room once more. Then, as the creak of the staircase seemed to grow louder, the door behind Leonard, already ajar, slammed shut with a force that rattled the house. Miss Marple's steps grew fainter, and for a moment, Leonard was left in the chilling quiet, grappling with a growing realization. The answers he sought were now slipping further out of reach. And as the weight of the mystery hung over him, a single question swirled in his mind: was it already too late to uncover the truth? The door behind him opened once more, but this time it wasn't Miss Marple who stepped through. The investigation begins. The sun had barely risen over St. Mary Mead, but the air inside Mrs. Strickland's house felt as cold as winter, despite the warm glow of the early morning light. Miss Marple, standing by the door, looked around, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the most mundane of moments. The house, once brimming with life and laughter, now felt hollow, like an old book gathering dust on a forgotten shelf. Leonard sat near the fireplace, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his face ashen. He was, on the surface, the picture of grief, a son mourning his lost mother, but Miss Marple's practiced eyes caught the subtle stiffness in his posture, the slight tremor in his jaw. It was as if the very grief he was supposed to be feeling was being forced upon him, as if he were playing a part in a tragedy he hadn't fully come to terms with. And that, Miss Marple knew, was often the sign of something more sinister. The housekeeper, Mrs. Burroughs, a woman in her late 50s with a stern expression, stood by the window, wringing her hands nervously. Her eyes were constantly darting to Leonard, as if she were expecting him to explode at any moment. But he didn't. He just sat there, the picture of detached sorrow. Miss Marple spoke first, her voice soft, but cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "Tell me, Mrs. Burroughs, how was Mrs. Strickland in her final days?" Mrs. Burroughs stiffened, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her apron. She hesitated for just a moment too long before answering. She was a little more frail, Miss Marple, but still sharp, always sharp with her words. Miss Marple nodded. "Sharp, you say? In what way?" The housekeeper shifted uncomfortably. "Well, she could be cutting sometimes, especially with those she didn't quite like. She had a way of making enemies, you see. Not that she ever showed it outright, but I've seen it." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Who would those enemies be, Mrs. Burroughs?" But before Mrs. Burroughs could respond, the door creaked open, and Dr. Prescott, the local doctor, entered the room. He was a man in his late 40s, with thinning hair and a face that seemed perpetually stuck between a frown and a grimace. He had been Mrs. Strickland's physician for years, and yet there was something about his demeanor now that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. He was acting too hurried, too eager to brush aside the tragedy as just another inevitable part of life. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a stiff nod. "What are you doing here? Surely you know that this is a natural death. Old age, nothing more." He spoke with the confidence of someone who had seen enough to know the truth. Yet, his eyes avoided meeting hers, darting toward Leonard, and then back to the door. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him for a moment, sharp as ever. "You're certain, Dr. Prescott? Number no lingering questions, no doubts." Her voice was gentle, but there was an underlying force that made the doctor shift uncomfortably on his feet. Dr. Prescott's lips tightened, and he cleared his throat. "Of course, Miss Marple. What else could there be?" But Miss Marple was already moving, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. She turned to Leonard, whose quiet sobs now seemed rehearsed, like a play he had been forced to act in. There was something about him, something off. She had seen it before. It was the look of a man trying to bury something he didn't want anyone to know. "Mr. Strickland," she said, her voice gentle but laced with an undeniable authority. "Tell me about your relationship with your mother. How was she in her last days?" Leonard's eyes flickered briefly, before his gaze hardened. We weren't as close as we should have been," he said, his voice low. "But she was my mother. And I loved her. Of course I did." His words were calm, but they felt like a performance-rehearsed script he was reading from. Miss Marple said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. Leonard's eyes darted nervously toward the mantelpiece, as if seeking an escape from the conversation. Miss Marple had seen it before, those little tells, the way people hid the truth by lying just enough to make it sound plausible. As the housekeeper and Dr. Prescott grew silent, Miss Marple continued her questioning, asking about the people closest to Mrs. Strickland, villagers who had ties to her, some for years, others only recently. It was clear that the late Mrs. Strickland wasn't as beloved as her son seemed to think. There were whispers of secrets long buried, old betrayals, and grudges that had never been spoken of, but lingered in the shadows like ghosts. One by one, the villagers spoke half-truths and silences that made the air feel thicker, heavier with suspicion. The widow who lived next door spoke of a dispute between Mrs. Strickland and her late husband, a disagreement over property that had never been resolved. The grocer mentioned how Mrs. Strickland had accused him of cheating her, only to later apologize, though the apology had never quite felt genuine. And the vicar, a man Miss Marple had always found to be a little too eager to forgive, hinted at a wrongdoing Mrs. Strickland had committed years ago, though he never went into detail. It became clear to Miss Marple that Mrs. Strickland's life was not as simple as Leonard wanted to believe. There were hidden stories, dark corners that hadn't been swept clean. And one of these secrets, she suspected, had something to do with her death. But what? As the morning sun poured in through the windows, Miss Marple stood, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together in her mind. She had gathered more than enough to know that Mrs. Strickland's death was no accident. But who would go to such lengths to hide the truth? The door clicked softly behind her as she stepped out, leaving behind a room full of unanswered questions. The investigation was just beginning. And already Miss Marple knew that the truth would not be easy to uncover. Cliffhanger ending. As Miss Marple turned to leave, her eyes fell upon a small, inconspicuous drawer in the corner of the room. It had been left slightly ajar. There, tucked inside, was a letter yellowed with age, the ink barely legible. She reached for it, a chill running down her spine. There, in Mrs. Strickland's unmistakable handwriting, were words that would change everything. "I know what you did. If anything happens to me, it will be your doing." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Who had Mrs. Strickland been threatening? And more importantly, was it the same person who had ended her life? The suspects. Twists start. The village of St. Mary Mead was as quiet as ever, but the air in Mrs. Strickland's house seemed to hum with an unspoken tension that Miss Marple couldn't ignore. Every corner of the house seemed to hold secrets, and every person Miss Marple spoke with raised more questions than answers. Leonard Strickland's reaction to his mother's death remained unsettling. As the days passed, his grief seemed to deepen only in the most superficial ways. He carried the air of a man burdened by responsibility, but not by genuine sorrow. When asked about the time he had spent with his mother, Leonard's responses were terse. His tone cold, nothing like the heartfelt mourning one might expect from a son who had just lost his mother. It was as if he were merely going through the motions. Miss Marple observed him closely, noting his distracted gaze and the nervous way he would clench his hands when someone mentioned Mrs. Strickland's name. Was his stoic behavior a mask for something darker? Or was it possible that their relationship wasn't as innocent as it seemed? She decided to speak with Mrs. Burrows, the housekeeper, hoping that perhaps she knew more about Leonard's behavior than she let on. Mrs. Burrows was a woman of few words, but Miss Marple's presence had a way of making people open up, even the most reticent. "Well, Miss Marple, I can tell you this about Mrs. Strickland," Mrs. Burrows began, her voice low, almost as if speaking the words aloud might somehow summon the past. She had a way of holding on to things, old grudges especially. She never let go of a slight. And she was sharp with her tongue, Miss Marple. I remember her telling Leonard off many times, though he was always so quiet. So very quiet. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Telling him off? What do you mean?" The housekeeper hesitated before continuing. She had a knack for stirring trouble between people. Little things, comments here and there, hints at past mistakes. Sometimes, I think she did it on purpose, just to see what would happen. Leonard. Well, I always thought he was more of a listener than a talker, but something in his eyes told me he was growing tired of her. Miss Marple's suspicions were starting to take shape. Leonard, the quiet son, had clearly borne the brunt of his mother's sharp words. Had one of those cutting remarks pushed him to the edge? Was that why he seemed so distant, so emotionally detached? Or perhaps he was hiding something darker, something Miss Marple would soon uncover. Miss Marple then turned her attention to Dr. Prescott, the family physician, a man who, in Miss Marple's experience, seemed to hide more behind his professional demeanor than he let on. When she approached him about the death, his response was swift, almost too swift. "It was natural causes, Miss Marple," Dr. Prescott said, his voice too quick, too dismissive. Mrs. Strickland was of an advanced age, and her health had been failing for some time. A sudden collapse, nothing suspicious about it at all. But there was something in his tone that made Miss Marple's skin crawl. It wasn't just the matter-of-fact way he spoke. It was the urgency in his words, as if he were trying too hard to convince her, perhaps to convince himself. "Are you sure?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but carrying an unspoken weight. Dr. Prescott shifted uncomfortably, his gaze avoiding hers. "Of course, it's the most logical conclusion. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Marple, but we must accept the facts as they are." Despite his assurances, Miss Marple felt a deep unease. Could Dr. Prescott be hiding something? Or was he perhaps too eager to close the case? She couldn't shake the feeling that his dismissal of the death as natural was more than just a simple medical opinion. Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to the house, back to Mrs. Strickland's belongings. There had to be something, some clue she had missed. She spent hours combing through the house, looking for something that might shed light on the mystery. And then, in the back of Mrs. Strickland's writing desk, hidden behind a stack of old papers, she found it. A letter old, yellowed with age, and worn at the edges. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Mrs. Strickland's, but it was the words that made Miss Marple's breath catch in her throat. "I know what you did. If anything happens to me, it will be your doing." Miss Marple's mind raced. Who had Mrs. Strickland been speaking to? And what had she meant by "what you did"? The letter was a clear thread, a message left behind for someone. But who was it intended for? Was this the final warning to someone who had already gone too far? Or was it a final act of defiance, the last words of a woman who had been pushed to her limit? Was this the final warning to someone who had already gone too far? Or was it a final act of defiance, the last words of a woman who had been pushed to her limit? Miss Marple's heart pounded in her chest as she folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. She knew this was the turning point. This letter held the key to everything. But it raised more questions than it answered. Who was the person Mrs. Strickland had warned, and why had she hidden this letter, carefully tucked away, as if it were a secret too dangerous to be known? The walls of the house seemed to close in around Miss Marple as she stepped away from the desk. The investigation had taken a darker turn. Now, more than ever, she felt the presence of someone watching her, someone who didn't want the truth to come out, and she knew that this letter, this cryptic warning, was just the beginning. Cliffhanger ending. As Miss Marple stood there, her mind racing, The soft sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. She froze. She wasn't alone. Turning slowly, she saw Leonard standing in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He took one step forward, then another, his breath shallow. "What have you found, Miss Marple?" His voice trembled. But there was something else there, something darker. Miss Marple held the letter tightly in her hand, her gaze never leaving Leonard's face. "I believe I've found something that explains more than you think, Mr. Strickland, but I'm afraid you're not going to like what comes next." The air between them crackled with tension as Leonard's gaze flickered nervously to the letter in Miss Marple's hand. What do you mean?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. But Miss Marple didn't answer. She just watched him carefully, knowing that whatever secrets Leonard was hiding, they were about to be exposed. The midpoint. The discovery Miss Marple had been waiting for finally arrived, not with a bang, but with a quiet whisper from the past. It was in the hidden corners of Miss Strickland's home, tucked away in the back of a dusty, neglected cabinet. There, beneath a pile of forgotten letters and old receipts, Miss Marple found what would change everything. An old, leather-bound family diary. The book was aged and worn, the pages brittle, but the ink was still legible. It belonged to Mrs. Strickland's late husband, and the tone of the entries was one Miss Marple could almost feel in her bonds, the weight of something buried too deep to ever truly remain hidden. She sat down at the small desk near the window, the light barely filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. As she turned the pages, the words within them seemed to grow louder, more urgent, and then she found its single, cryptic entry that made her heart stop. "I can't let it go on like this. The blackmail has gone too far. What she has on me will ruin everything. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. She says she'll expose it all if I don't comply." Miss Marple's breath caught in her throat. Blackmail. Mrs. Strickland had been blackmailing someone. But who? And why? The name in the diary was smudged, as though the writer had hesitated to record it. It was clear someone had been under Mrs. Strickland's control for years. But why? What could this secret be that was so dangerous it could destroy lives? The clues were all there, but they led in so many directions that Miss Marple could feel herself teetering on the edge of a dangerous precipice. Miss Marple's mind raced. The blackmail wasn't just a random act of cruelty. It was personal. It was tied to something or some close to Mrs. Strickland, someone who had far more to lose than Miss Marple had initially realized. The web of deceit seemed to stretch wider with every passing moment, and the more she uncovered, the darker the picture became. Miss Marple needed answers. Who was this person being blackmailed? What could they be hiding? And why had Mrs. Strickland been so ruthless, willing to manipulate someone she knew so intimately? Her gaze flickered back to the diary, and she noticed something else, subtle but significant detail. In the very last entry, the handwriting was shakier, more frantic. It spoke of a final meeting, a confrontation that had happened just days before Mrs. Strickland's death. A meeting Miss Marple was sure had taken place in this very house. The final warning. "Tomorrow I will be done with it. No more games. She says she'll tell him everything. I don't think she will." The cryptic line hung in the air like a heavy fog. What had Mrs. Strickland meant by "done with it"? And who was he? Miss Marple's pulse quickened. She now understood that Mrs. Strickland's death wasn't an accident. It was tied to something far deeper, something far more sinister than she had originally suspected. This wasn't a simple case of a bitter, sharp-tongued old woman getting her comeuppance. No, this was about a secret so dark, so dangerous, it had led someone to murder. Miss Marple carefully closed the diary, her mind whirring with possibilities. It was clear that whoever had been blackmailed had reached their breaking point and had decided to take control. But who? The puzzle pieces were starting to come together. But the truth was still elusive, dancing just beyond her reach. Miss Marple stood, the weight of the discovery sinking in. She had more to uncover, and soon. The only question was who had been desperate enough to kill to keep their secret safe, and who among those she had spoken with could be hiding the truth. As she returned to Mrs. Strickland's study, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder now, every shift of the wind outside a potential warning. And then, just as she was about to leave the room, she noticed something that stopped her cold. A small, ornate key sitting on the desk, half hidden beneath a pile of papers. It was an old-fashioned key unlike any she had seen before. She picked it up carefully, her mind racing. Was this the key to the hidden secret? The missing piece to the puzzle that would explain everything? She had to find out. But as she turned the key over in her hand, she heard a faint sound, the unmistakable click of the door opening behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping in her chest, only to find Leonard standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something between fear and suspicion. "What are you doing here, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice too soft, too forced. "You've been in here for quite a while." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the key, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. She didn't answer immediately, studying Leonard's face for any hint of the truth. "I was just examining the room, Mr. Strickland," she said calmly, though her mind was racing. "I believe I may have found something." Leonard's eyes flickered to the key in her hand, and for a moment his expression faltered. It was almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. It was a flash of fear of guilt. "Something important?" he asked, his voice shaky. Miss Marple didn't reply. She simply slipped the key into her pocket, her gaze never leaving his face. "You might want to be careful, Mr. Strickland," she said quietly. "You never know what's hidden right under your nose." As she turned to leave, she heard Leonard's footsteps follow her down the hallway faster now, as if he were in a hurry to be rid of her. But Miss Marple knew that the discovery she had made was far from over. It had only just begun. Cliffhanger ending. As Miss Marple reached the door, she heard the faint sound of paper rustling behind her. She turned quickly, her heart pounding. Leonard had taken a step back into the study. A quick glance at the desk told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. The key was gone. It had vanished, disappeared. Leonard had taken it. "Mr. Strickland," she called, her voice sharp. "Where is it?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he walked briskly away from her, his back to her, as if he had done nothing wrong. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. What was he hiding? And what was behind that locked door? She knew she was dangerously close to the truth, but she also knew that whatever Leonard had done to get rid of the key, he was running out of time. Time was running out for all of them. The investigation deepens. Miss Marple's revelation. As Miss Marple wandered through the rooms of the Strickland house, the once comforting atmosphere now felt heavy, charged with tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind seemed to whisper secrets that had remained buried for far too long. She had been thinking about Mrs. Strickland's death, piecing together the delicate threads of her investigation. But now, something had shifted in her mind. It was no longer about a simple case of murder, no longer about a sharp-tongued woman who had simply overstayed her welcome. This was more, much more. With the discovery of the old family diary and the mention of blackmail, Miss Marple began to see the true scope of the case. The whispers in the village, the coldness between family members, the vague sense of discomfort that seemed to seep into every conversation, it all pointed to a dark, festering secret. Someone had killed Mrs. Strickland to protect something, or someone. Miss Marple stood before the grand fireplace in the sitting room, her hands clasped behind her back. The cold, flickering light from the hearth danced across the room, but it couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her bones. She thought of Leonard, whose strange emotional detachment had raised so many questions. She thought of the housekeeper, whose cryptic words had hinted at so much more than she was letting on. But most of all, she thought of the diary. It was there that the pieces began to fall into place. Mrs. Strickland had been blackmailing someone close to her. Someone who, for reasons unknown, had been forced to bear the weight of a shameful secret. The name had remained elusive in the diary, smudged, almost intentionally blurred, but Miss Marple could feel it in her gut. It was someone powerful, someone who had the means and motive to silence her forever. It wasn't just about money or greed. No, this was about something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of the Strickland family, something that had been waiting to be unearthed. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more it became clear. Mrs. Strickland's death wasn't an act of simple vengeance. It was a carefully calculated move. A move made to stop the truth from coming to light. Suddenly, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching the hallway, a soft shuffle, almost hesitant, yet deliberate. She straightened, her heart quickening for a moment, but she didn't turn. She had already come to know the rhythm of the house. It was Leonard. She took a step toward the door, pausing just long enough to peer through the crack. Leonard was standing by the staircase, glancing nervously toward the study door. His back was turned to her, but she could see his hands trembling ever so slightly. He was hiding something. She was certain of it now. The key had disappeared, and Leonard knew more than he was letting on. There was something about the way he'd reacted when Miss Marple had found the letter in Mrs. Strickland's desk, something about the way he had stiffened when the word blackmail had crossed her lips. His nerves were betraying him. As Miss Marple quietly followed him down the corridor, her eyes caught a glint of something unusual in the dim light, a shadow, a figure, passing by the study window. Her pulse quickened. Who else was in the house? Someone else was watching. Someone who didn't want the truth to come out. Could it be the housekeeper, Dr. Prescott? Or perhaps it was someone even closer to Mrs. Strickland? Without making a sound, Miss Marple stepped back into the room, her mind racing. She needed to find out what Leonard was hiding and why he seemed to be so desperate to keep the investigation from progressing. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the desk, and in a sudden moment of clarity, she realized that she had been overlooking something. The desk, a seemingly innocuous piece of furniture, had hidden compartments. She had seen them before, tucked neatly behind the drawers, but never thought to investigate. Now she felt an undeniable pull to search deeper. Could it hold the answers she was desperately seeking? As she lifted the top drawer with careful precision, a piece of paper unfolded, stained with age, caught her eye. It was another letter, but this one was different. It was not from Mrs. Strickland's hand. No, it was from someone else, a man. The words were terse, written in hurried, slanted script. "You will not speak of this. You will stop digging, or there will be consequences. You know too much now. There is no going back." Her breath hitched. This was it. The letter she had been waiting for, the final clue to understanding who had wanted to keep the Strickland family secret buried. Someone had not just wanted Mrs. Strickland's silence, they had been protecting something far darker, something much bigger than the old woman's sharp words and petty grudges. Miss Marple's mind raced with possibilities. She had come this far, but now she realized the stakes were higher than ever. She could feel the danger pressing in, surrounding her from every side. Whoever had killed Mrs. Strickland wasn't afraid to strike again to keep their secret safe. Just as she stood, carefully holding the letter in her hand, a sound shattered the silence, a loud thud from behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but saw nothing. And then, as if the house itself were conspiring against her, the door slammed shut. A bolt of terror shot through her, and she was plunged into complete darkness. For a long moment, Miss Marple stood frozen, trying to steady her breath. What was happening? Was someone trying to trap her? But she couldn't waste time. She had to act. She had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Cliffhanger ending. A sudden voice from the darkness stopped her cold. It was Leonard, his voice shaking, strained. "You're too close, Miss Marple. You don't understand. You'll never be able to solve this. It's already over." Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind working at lightning speed. She wasn't about to back down now. Not when she was so close. "I'm not afraid of the truth, Mr. Strickland," she said, her voice steady, though her pulse raced in her ears. "And neither are you." But just as she spoke, a loud crash echoed through the hallway. Someone was coming. Someone who would stop at nothing to ensure the truth stayed hidden. Miss Marple's heart pounded. The game had changed. The danger was real now. And the truth? It was just within her grasp. The final act. As the mystery surrounding Mrs. Strickland's death continued to unfold, the house seemed to grow darker with each passing hour. The walls, once silent, now whispered secrets that had been hidden for years, secrets that no one had dared to bring to the surface. Until now. Miss Marple's sharp mind had pieced together most of the puzzle, but there was still something missing, something crucial that had been overlooked. That is, until an unexpected visitor arrived. It was a person who had long been thought to have disappeared from the Strickland family's life, a figure from Mrs. Strickland's past, who had been believed to have moved away years ago, never to return. But fate had a different plan. The doorbell rang one late evening, and when the door opened, it revealed the one person Miss Marple had not accounted for in her investigation. Sarah Wilding, Mrs. Strickland's estranged niece. Sarah, pale and gaunt, stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She had returned to the house after years of silence, and her arrival seemed to send a ripple of unease through the very fabric of the Strickland family. Leonard, upon seeing her, stiffened, his face pale. The housekeeper's hands trembled, and even Dr. Prescott seemed momentarily shaken. It was clear that Sarah's return was no mere coincidence. Miss Marple's instincts flared. She had suspected that there was more to the Strickland family than met the eye, but now she knew this was the final piece of the puzzle. Sarah had been involved in something far deeper, something that had tied her to Mrs. Strickland's dark past. But what? And why had she stayed away for so long? As Sarah entered the house, Miss Marple took her time observing her every movement. She was clearly troubled, her eyes darting nervously around the familiar, yet foreign, surroundings. Her presence was unsettling, and it was clear she had a deep connection to the family's secrets that had remained buried for too long. Miss Marple wasted no time. She approached Sarah in the sitting room, where the tension in the air was palpable. Sarah's hands clutched the edges of her coat tightly, as though she were trying to hold on to something fragile, something precious. Miss Marple didn't waste words. "You've come back for a reason, haven't you, Miss Wilding?" she asked softly, her voice calm yet laced with the sharpness of experience. "You've come back for a reason, haven't you, Miss Wilding?" she asked softly, her voice calm yet laced with the sharpness of experience. Sarah's eyes flickered nervously. I had no choice. I had to come back." Miss Marple leaned in, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "What happened? What are you hiding?" Sarah swallowed hard, her lips trembling. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "It's about the treasure, the family treasure. My aunt, she was obsessed with it. It's been hidden for years, and it's the reason for all the secrets, the blackmail, the threats. All of it was to protect what she had found." Miss Marple's heart raced. A hidden family treasure. Could this be the key to everything? Mrs. Strickland's death was no longer just a simple act of murder. It was the final step in a much larger, far more dangerous game. Sarah continued, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth she had carried for so long. "The treasure is real, Miss Marple. It's not some myth. It was hidden by my grandfather, a long time ago. And my aunt, she discovered it. She knew where it was, and she used it to control people. She threatened anyone who got too close to the truth. But she couldn't stop what was coming. The treasure. It's more than just money or jewels. It's power. And it's cursed." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. A cursed treasure. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there were still so many questions. Why had Mrs. Strickland kept this treasure a secret for so long? Who had killed her and why? Suddenly, a sharp noise interrupted their conversation, the sound of something heavy falling to the floor. Miss Marple turned quickly, her eyes scanning the room. Something was wrong. There, by the fireplace, was an envelope. It had fallen from the old leather-bound book that Mrs. Strickland had kept hidden away for years, the book Miss Marple had examined earlier in the investigation. Without thinking, Miss Marple moved toward the envelope. It was old, yellowed with age, but the seal was still intact. With a steady hand, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The words were hastily written, but they were clear. The letter was dated years ago, and it contained shocking details about the hidden treasure that had been the center of Mrs. Strickland's power. It was not just money or jewels that had been hidden, it was a map that led to something far more valuable and dangerous, and it was in the hands of someone who had killed to keep it hidden. The letter spoke of a secret room within the Strickland house, a room that had been sealed off for decades. The treasure had been locked away there, and anyone who had come close to discovering it had been silenced by Mrs. Strickland's threats, her manipulation, and eventually by death. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she processed the implications of the letter. She had always suspected there was more to this case than met the eye, but now she knew Mrs. Strickland's death had been the result of a desperate bid to protect this treasure. But why was it worth killing for? Just as Miss Marple was about to share her discovery with Sarah, a loud crash echoed through the house. The sound of breaking glass followed by hurried footsteps made her heart race. Someone else was here, someone who had been listening to their conversation. Miss Marple's instincts screamed that time was running out. The killer was still in the house, and they would stop at nothing to protect the treasure. Cliffhanger ending. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Leonard appeared in the doorway, his face twisted with panic. "You have to stop, Miss Marple. It's too dangerous. You don't know what you're dealing with. They'll kill you too." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Who, Leonard? Who is they?" Before Leonard could answer, a shadow moved behind him, too fast, too silent. A figure stepped into the room, their face hidden by a hood, and the sound of a gun being cocked echoed in the silence. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The last thing she saw before the door slammed shut was Leonard's terrified face and the figure advancing toward her, determined to stop her investigation, once and for all. Who was the true mastermind behind Mrs. Strickland's death? Would Miss Marple be able to unravel the mystery before it was too late? The clock was ticking. The game had changed. Miss Marple's quiet revelation, gripping suspense. The quiet hours of the evening had fallen over the Strickland house, and Miss Marple, as always, had settled into her corner by the window, observing the family members like a quiet, steady observer of the shifting tides of fate. The house, with its hollowed, echoing rooms and thick, heavy air, seemed to pulse with secrets, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing. Each small gesture, each nervous glance, was a clue waiting to be uncovered. There was one person who had caught her eye's quiet, unassuming figure in the background of the family's gatherings. Edward Strickland, Mrs. Strickland's reclusive nephew. He had been largely ignored by the family and the household staff, his presence barely noted, a shadow in the corners. At first, Miss Marple had thought little of him, just another relative, who seemed content to keep his distance. But there was something in his eyes, something in the way he always lingered at the edges of conversations, watching, listening, never quite joining in. It was that faint spark of interest that led Miss Marple to observe him more closely. She had seen him in the garden one afternoon, standing near the old garden shed, his back to her, staring at something intently. The way his hands gripped the weathered wood of the doorframe suggested tension, as if he were about to turn around and run. But something held him in place, something he feared more than being seen. The next evening, Miss Marple casually approached him, her voice soft and inviting, her presence calm and non-threatening. Edward's nervous reaction was telling a sharp intake of breath, a visible stiffening of his posture. He was hiding something. She could feel it in the air. "Mr. Strickland," she began, her tone casual but piercing. "I've been meaning to ask you if you ever noticed anything unusual about your aunt's affairs. Something out of the ordinary." Edward's face went pale at the mention of his aunt, his eyes darting around nervously, but he quickly masked his fear with a forced smile. "No, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a little too steady. "I've been away for years. I never really. I didn't have the chance to pay much attention." But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. His words didn't match the unease in his eyes. There was more to his reluctance than mere indifference. She knew it. She had seen enough in her time to recognize the signs of a guilty conscience. Later that evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Miss Marple found herself wandering the house once more. She passed through the narrow corridor and paused outside Edward's room. Through the thin crack of the door, she heard soft, muffled voices. Someone was inside, speaking in hushed tones, Edward's voice, accompanied by another, more urgent and demanding. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but she kept herself composed. She had to know what was going on. Carefully, she leaned in closer, straining to catch the words. The conversation was low and indistinct, but one thing became clear. Edward was being pressured, threatened even. The other voice, an unfamiliar one, spoke of things Miss Marple could not yet understand, but it was clear that this hidden figure knew more about the Strickland family secrets than anyone had realized. With careful precision, Miss Marple backed away from the door and waited until the voices stopped. Moments later, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving swiftly down the corridor, the faint scrape of shoes against the floor. Whoever had been in there was gone. It was then that Miss Marple knew Edward was hiding something far darker than anyone had imagined. He wasn't just a shy, withdrawn nephew. He was someone who had been living under the constant threat of exposure, someone who would do anything to protect a long-buried family secret. The next morning, Miss Marple's suspicions were confirmed. She found a small, crumpled letter hidden in the corner of a desk drawer that had clearly been carelessly discarded. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the ink smudged in places, as though the writer had been in a rush to send it but hadn't wanted to leave any trace. The letter was addressed to Edward Strickland, though it was not signed. The contents were chilling. "I know what you've been hiding. If you want to keep your secret safe, you will do as I say. No one must find out what really happened to your father, not your aunt, not your family. If you don't cooperate, I will expose everything, and the consequences will be dire. Remember, some things are worth killing for." The words sent a shock through Miss Marple. Edward's father, what was the secret? What had happened to him? And what connection did it have to Mrs. Strickland's death? Miss Marple understood now. Edward's past, his family's history, and the dark undercurrent that ran through their lives were more entwined than anyone had known. Edward's fear was not only of the law or his family, was of someone who had already demonstrated they were willing to kill to keep a secret buried. Miss Marple knew she had to act quickly. The longer this secret remained hidden, the more dangerous it became. Someone had already killed once, and they would not hesitate to do it again if their secret was at risk. She had only one option left: confront Edward before it was too late. But when she arrived at his room, the door was ajar, and the room was empty, gone without a trace. Panic stirred within her chest. Had he run? Or had something far more sinister happened? Cliffhanger ending. As Miss Marple stood in the empty room, her mind racing with possibilities, a sudden noise behind her made her whip around. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway. It was Edward. But he looked different, his eyes wild, his face pale. In his trembling hands, he held something family heirloom, an ancient gleaming key. I can't let you go any further, Miss Marple," he whispered, his voice strained with fear. "If you do, it'll be the end of us all." And with that, the door slammed shut behind him, leaving Miss Marple standing alone in the darkened room, the mystery deepening around her. Would she be able to unlock the secret in time? Or would the Strickland family's buried past claim another victim? The answers were just within reach, but not without great risk. The clock was ticking, and Miss Marple knew that someone was desperate to ensure that some truths never saw the light of day. The climax. The dimly lit drawing room of Mrs. Strickland's grand house felt colder now, its once regal warmth replaced by an air of suspicion and tension. The heavy curtains were drawn, blocking out the afternoon sun, leaving the room in an eerie twilight. Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, her calm gaze sweeping over the gathered guests. The old clock on the mantel ticked loudly, each second amplifying the stillness in the room. It was a moment of reckoning, one that Miss Marple had known was inevitable. Seated before her were the suspects, the members of the Strickland family, and those closest to the late Mrs. Strickland. They were all here, each wearing the mask of innocence, yet Miss Marple could see the telltale signs of guilt beneath their surfaces. She had observed them closely over the past days, and now the truth was about to come to light. "Let's begin, shall we?" Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady but carrying the weight of certainty. "We've all been circling around the same questions, but as with all mysteries, the truth is simpler than we imagine. The answer lies not in complex motives or elusive clues, but in a single undeniable fact. Mrs. Strickland's death was not a random act of violence, it was a carefully planned execution of a long-standing grudge." She paused, her eyes gliding from one suspect to the next. But why now? Why kill her now, after all these years? The room fell silent. The faces before her were a mixture of unease and confusion. Each one seemed to be waiting for someone else to crack, to reveal their secret. It was Edward Strickland, standing rigid at the back of the room, who broke the silence. His face was pale, his lips pressed tightly together. His hands trembled ever so slightly, betraying the composure he tried so hard to maintain. He had been quiet throughout the investigation, but now, as Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, a flicker of panic crossed his eyes. "Edward," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm, yet sharp like a blade, "you are the one who held the key to this mystery all along. Your aunt's death was not about money, nor was it about her meddling in family affairs. It was about an old wound that had been festering for years." The air seemed to tighten, and the breath of the gathered crowd caught in their throats. Miss Marple turned her attention to the others in the room: Leonard, the distant son, and Dr. Prescott, the family physician. Both appeared unnerved, their eyes darting to one another, but neither spoke. With an almost imperceptible smile, Miss Marple continued, "Mrs. Strickland was blackmailing someone who feared that their secret would be exposed, and that person, my dear friends, is none other than Dr. Prescott." Gasps filled the room as Dr. Prescott recoiled in horror. His face drained of color, and his hand shot out to steady himself against the arm of his chair. "Me?" he stammered, his voice quivering. "That's impossible. What could I have to hide?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. "You see, Dr. Prescott, your professional reputation, your career is what was at stake. But it was not just any mistake, was it? It was a mistake that involved Mrs. Strickland's husband, the very man who was once your patient. A man whose death was, I suspect, not entirely natural." Dr. Prescott's lips trembled as his gaze dropped to the floor. His entire body was rigid, but Miss Marple could see the guilt, the shame, written plainly in his features. The room was silent, waiting for him to deny the accusation. But he didn't. Instead, his voice cracked with confession. "It was an accident," he whispered hoarsely. I had been treating Mr. Strickland for months, but I made a grave error. He had a condition I didn't catch in time. I thought I could cover it up quietly. I thought I could erase the mistake. But then she found out. Mrs. Strickland, she always had a way of getting to the truth. She threatened me, and when I refused to comply with her demands, she began to manipulate me. She blackmailed me with what I had done. The confession hung in the air like a heavy fog. The truth was out now, but the full picture had yet to be revealed. "Edward," Miss Marple said, turning slowly to face him again, "you have been protecting your uncle's murderer all along, haven't you? You knew, and you let him get away with it. The pressure, the threat to your family's reputation was too great for you to resist. You never could allow anyone to find out what really happened to your father. And when Mrs. Strickland started digging into your family's secrets, she had to be silenced." Edward's face twisted in anguish, the weight of guilt crushing him. He looked at his hands as though they were the hands of a stranger, as if he could not reconcile the man in front of him with the actions he had taken. "Miss Marple, I didn't know what to do," he muttered. "My father's legacy, my family, it was all at risk. She would have ruined everything. I thought I was doing the right thing. But now, I realize what I've done." Miss Marple's gaze softened for a brief moment, though her voice remained steady. "In our darkest moments, we make choices that haunt us. But it is never too late to face the truth." As the confession resonated through the room, Miss Marple paused, allowing the weight of the revelation to settle over the family. The Strickland house was no longer a place of power or privilege. It had become the backdrop for a tragic unraveling. Cliffhanger ending. But just as the finality of the moment settled, a sudden sound cut through the tension: the sharp, distinct ring of the doorbell. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. There was no more time for pondering what had happened. Whoever was at the door had come for a reason, and Miss Marple knew that no mystery ever truly ended with a neat bow. There was always more to uncover, always more to reveal. The room held its breath, and Miss Marple, unfazed, nodded to the butler standing in the doorway. "Please, "Let them in," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes gleaming with the knowledge that another revelation was coming. As the door creaked open, everyone in the room turned to face the newcomer. Would this person hold the key to yet another dark secret? Or was this just the beginning of another tale of deception, revenge, and betrayal? The clock ticked on, and the mystery of Mrs. Strickland's death was far from over. One night, in the darkness, a woman falls down the stairs, and her dog watches, barking. Was it an accident? Or was a ruthless killer executing a sinister plan? The night was thick with fog, the kind that settled like a blanket over the countryside, muffling even the faintest of sounds. Emily Arundel stood at the top of the grand staircase in her ancient Berkshire mansion, her frail figure silhouetted by the dim light of a single candle. Her eyes, sharp yet filled with an air of unease, seemed to peer into the oppressive darkness below, as though searching for something or someone she couldn't quite place. The old house creaked and groaned under the weight of its age, and the faint, eerie whisper of the wind outside seemed to carry with it a warning. But what that warning was, Emily couldn't decipher. She had always felt uneasy in this house, but tonight it felt different. The air was thick, oppressive, as if something was lurking just out of sight. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains, seemed to amplify the growing tension in the room. Bob, her loyal fox terrier, stood by her side, his ears pricked, his small body trembling slightly in the charged atmosphere. Emily's heart raced as her grip tightened on the banister, her knuckles turning white. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. There was a strange heaviness in the air, a sense of impending doom that gnawed at her. Then, as if the house itself had decided to play a cruel trick on her, the floor beneath her seemed to shift. Her foot slipped. A small gasp escaped her lips before she tumbled forward, her body spiraling downward, helpless in its descent. She crashed violently against the stone steps, the sound of her fall echoing through the empty halls, a final scream of despair swallowed by the thick fog outside. Bob barked fiercely, his shrill cries piercing the silence, as if calling for help. His frantic paws scraped the ground, circling his fallen mistress. Emily lay motionless at the base of the stairs, her eyes wide open but unseeing, staring blankly into the void. The night continued its eerie silence, broken only by the sound of Bob's frantic barking. And then, the mansion fell still, the kind of stillness that spoke volumes of secrets long buried. The next morning, a letter was hastily written, its words shaky yet desperate. Emily's handwriting, though once steady and proud, trembled with the weight of fear and suspicion. In it, she addressed the letter to none other than the famous detective Hercule Poirot. "I fear for my life. I believe someone in my household wishes to see me dead. I know this sounds impossible, but I cannot ignore what I have seen, what I have felt. I beg you to come quickly, before it is too late." The letter was sent off, but Emily never saw the reply. Her body was found the next day, cold and lifeless, with no signs of struggle, no obvious cause of death. The physicians whispered of liver disease, but the truth seemed far darker. And the questions, they lingered, unanswered. Cliffhanger. What secrets does this mansion hold? What malevolent force is at work within these walls? Who wanted Emily Arundel dead? The arrival. Weeks had passed since Emily Arundel's desperate letter had been sent. The ink on the paper had barely dried when Hercule Poirot received it, his sharp eyes scanning the words carefully, his mind already working at full speed. The letter spoke of fear, of someone in the household wanting to kill Emily, a claim so serious that it could not be taken lightly. He had, of course, read many strange letters in his time, but there was something in Emily's words that made him take immediate action. Without hesitation, Poirot packed his bags and made arrangements to leave, Captain Hastings at his side, always the ever-loyal companion. As the two men traveled through the damp, fog-laden streets, their minds were heavy with thoughts of what awaited them at the Arundel estate. The journey had been long, but Poirot remained silent, lost in thought. Hastings, noticing Poirot's preoccupation, didn't press him. Poirot's mind was always a labyrinth of deduction, each twist and turn leading him closer to a truth only he could see. Upon arriving at the Grand Arundel mansion, Poirot was struck by the eerie stillness that hung in the air. The once proud home now appeared neglected, as if time itself had forgotten to grace its walls. Poirot and Hastings were led inside by the housekeeper, whose face was drawn, as though she too sensed the darkness that had taken root here. "Emily Arundel, where is she?" Poirot inquired, his voice calm yet sharp with intent. The housekeeper's eyes flickered nervously before she answered, her voice barely a whisper. She has passed away, Monsieur Poirot." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Poirot's sharp gaze never wavered, his mind already racing to piece together the truth. He turned to the family physician, Dr. Granger, who stood nearby, an expression of professional detachment masking the sorrow in his eyes. "Her death," Dr. Granger began, his tone measured, "was the result of liver disease. A long battle. We did everything we could." Poirot studied the physician intently, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And yet, you cannot be sure, can you, mon ami?" he said, his voice calm but laced with the sharpness of suspicion. Dr. Granger seemed taken aback by the detective's directness. He cleared his throat. It was expected. She had been unwell for some time. The symptoms were clear. "Ah," Poirot replied softly, his fingers tapping against his chin as he pondered. "The symptoms, but not the cause, perhaps." Hastings watched Poirot, perplexed by the detective's insistence on uncertainty. He, too, had seen the state of the house and the solemn air hanging over the family. But Poirot wasn't satisfied with the doctor's diagnosis. Something was off, something hidden beneath the surface. Poirot moved quietly through the house, examining every detail, every small inconsistency, as his sharp mind sought out answers. He asked questions, each one calculated, probing beneath the surface of the seemingly innocuous. Emily's death, it seemed, was far from natural. There were signs, faint, almost imperceptible, that someone had gone to great lengths to cover up something darker, something more sinister. As Poirot stepped into Emily's room, a shiver ran down his spine. There was an unnatural stillness to the room, an unease in the air that seemed to cling to everything: the heavy curtains, the antique furniture, the scent of lavender in the air. Poirot's gaze landed on a small object near the window, a broken glass, its jagged edges catching the light in an unsettling way. There were no signs of a struggle, no marks on the body. Yet, Poirot's trained eyes saw what others missed: the faintest smear of something dark near the glass. "What is this, I wonder?" Poirot muttered to himself, picking up the glass carefully with his gloved hands. Hastings, who had followed Poirot into the room, was visibly shaken by the scene. "Do you think she was murdered, Poirot?" Poirot paused for a long moment, his eyes scanning the room once more. The mystery was deepening, layers upon layers of deception hidden behind the scenes. Emily's sudden death, the letter, the strange marks, the doctor's quick diagnosis, all of it was part of something much larger. He turned to Hastings, his voice low but filled with certainty. "It is too soon to say, mon ami, but there is much more to this than liver disease. I am certain of that." The air in the room grew colder, heavier. Poirot stood there, his mind racing as he pieced together the puzzle in front of him. He knew the truth was hiding just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. But as he stood in Emily's room, one thing was certain: this was no ordinary death. Cliffhanger. Was this truly a natural death, or is something far darker, more sinister at play? The investigation begins. The air in the Arundel mansion had grown colder since Poirot's arrival, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. As he began his investigation, Poirot knew that the truth would not come easily. There was something hidden in the shadows of this grand estate, something dark that lurked in the hearts of Emily's family. Poirot sat in the drawing room, his sharp eyes flicking from one relative to another as he prepared to speak with them. These were the people who had been closest to Emily, and yet they were also the most likely to have motives. The scene was set, the game was afoot, and Poirot's every instinct was on high alert. Charles, the charming nephew, with a shady past. Charles Arundel entered the room with an air of effortless charm. His clothes were well-tailored, his smile smooth, and his demeanor seemingly pleasant. But there was something about him that didn't sit right with Poirot. The man exuded a polished confidence, but beneath that was the unmistakable scent of desperation. He was broke, desperately broke, and his charming exterior masked a man who had been living off others for too long. "I'm sorry for your loss, Monsieur Poirot," Charles said with a bow, though his eyes avoided Poirot's, his nervous habit betraying him. Poirot studied Charles for a moment, his mind working as he examined the man's every movement. Charles's financial ruin, his sudden but steady presence in Emily's life, and the vague whispers of past indiscretions were all pieces of the puzzle. Poirot had read between the lines of the family's history and had no illusions about Charles's true character. A man without resources, a man with debts to pay, such a person might go to great lengths to secure an inheritance. And yet, there was something more here, something Charles was hiding, something that Poirot had not yet uncovered. "Tell me, Charles," Poirot said, his voice smooth and disarming. "What was your relationship with your aunt? Was it close, or strained, perhaps?" Charles laughed, though the sound was hollow. "We were family, Monsieur Poirot. Close enough, I suppose. But, well, you know, money changes everything, doesn't it?" Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Indeed, money does have that effect." Charles hesitated. Poirot knew he was holding back, but the question remained. Was it simply greed that had driven Charles, or was there something more sinister brewing beneath the surface? Teresa, the glamorous niece, with a penchant for danger. Next, Poirot met Teresa Arundel, a woman whose beauty was as dangerous as her nature. She entered the room with an undeniable air of sophistication, her attire elegant, her smile flirtatious. She moved with the grace of someone used to getting what they wanted, and Poirot could tell instantly that her charm was as sharp as a blade. "I trust you find the house to your liking, Monsieur Poirot," Teresa said, her voice as smooth as silk, laced with an undertone of calculation. "It's a bit of a tomb now, isn't it? A family buried under secrets, not all of them pleasant." Poirot leaned back in his chair, observing her intently. There was something unsettling about Teresa, a glamour that hid a far more dangerous, reckless side. Her penchant for excitement was no secret. She had lived a life of indulgence and flirtation, of running on the edge of danger, and perhaps of more serious indiscretions. She had often been seen in the company of men who were better left forgotten. The question was, what did she want from her aunt? Was she grieving, or was there something else at play here? "Tell me, Madame Arundel," Poirot asked, his voice calm yet probing. "Where were you the night your aunt passed?" Teresa's eyes flickered, her perfect smile never wavering. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, do you suspect me of something? I was at a party, a soirée, if you will, with friends. You know how it is. One needs to keep up appearances." Poirot did not respond immediately, but his eyes narrowed. The party, the friends, it all felt rehearsed, too neat. Teresa's gaze didn't meet his directly now, and that told Poirot everything he needed to know. There was a lie buried somewhere beneath her calculated charm. Bella, the troubled niece, trapped in an unhappy marriage. Finally, Poirot met Bella Arundel, the most sorrowful of Emily's nieces, whose heartache was evident in the way she carried herself. She was slender, delicate, and seemed to shrink into the shadows of the room, avoiding the light. Her gaze, too, was haunted, as though something she had seen in life had broken her, and she could never escape it. Poirot's gaze softened as he studied her, but he knew better than to be swayed by appearances. Bella's troubled marriage to her controlling Greek husband, Jacob Tanios, had been the subject of whispered gossip for years. Jacob was a man whose temper was as volatile as his wealth, and he had never hidden his disdain for Bella's family. The relationship between the two seemed to be one of manipulation and fear, with Bella trapped in a cage she couldn't escape. "Madame Bella," Poirot said gently, "I understand you have suffered. But what of your aunt? What was your relationship with her, and where were you the night of her passing?" Bella's eyes darted nervously, and her hands trembled slightly in her lap. I was at home," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob, he was with me. Poirot could see the lie in her eyes, but why was she lying? Was it out of fear of her husband, or was there something more to the story? Bella seemed to know more than she was letting on, and Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that her unease was tied to something darker, something that could very well involve her aunt's death. Cliffhanger. As Poirot surveyed the three suspects before him, his mind raced. Each one had a motive, each one a shadow hanging over them. But only one thing was certain. Emily's death was no accident. Someone in this room had orchestrated it, but who? Was it the charming yet desperate Charles, whose debts had led him to the brink? Was it the glamorous Teresa, whose reckless ambition was masked by beauty? Or was it Bella, the broken niece, whose marriage to a cruel man had left her a prisoner in her own life? Poirot's eyes lingered on them, the silence growing thicker with each passing second. He could feel the walls closing in. But the question remained, which one was the murderer? And more importantly, who would be next? Who is hiding the darkest secret of all, and what lengths will they go to in order to protect it? Poirot discovers Emily's changed will. The investigation had taken Poirot to many dark corners of the Arundel estate, but it was the discovery of Emily's newly altered will that truly sent a chill through his veins. After weeks of carefully observing the family, the servants, and the house itself, Poirot had uncovered fragments of an unsettling truth. He had known something was wrong from the start, the way Emily's relatives had reacted to her death, the anxious glances exchanged in the drawing room, the sharp undercurrents of resentment. But now, this new revelation opened a door to a much deeper, more dangerous conspiracy. Poirot sat in his study, a single candle flickering on the desk, his eyes scanning the will in front of him. It had been altered only weeks before Emily's sudden demise. What once had been a straightforward distribution of Emily's considerable fortune to her niece and nephew had changed dramatically. Emily Arundel had left everything to her quiet, unassuming companion, Minnie Lawson. Minnie, a meek woman in her late 40s, had spent years by Emily's side, her presence almost invisible. She had no family, no fortune, no claims to anything in the world except for her bond with Emily. And now, Emily had made her the sole beneficiary of her vast estate. Poirot's mind raced as he carefully examined the document. There were no signs of tampering, no visible ink smudges, no reason to believe that the will had been forged, yet the timing was all too perfect. Just before her death, Emily had rewritten her will to disinherit her family, a family already steeped in suspicion, and a family who would now stand to lose everything. The question now was, had Emily's family been desperate enough to kill her to prevent this new will from coming into effect? Poirot knew better than to trust appearances. There was something here, something more sinister than simple greed. As he flipped through the pages, something caught his eye. A note written in Emily's delicate handwriting, scrawled on the back of the will. It was addressed to Minnie, and the words were sharp, urgent, and unsettling. "You are in danger, Minnie. They will stop at nothing to get what they think they deserve. Trust no one. Do not let them find you." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he read the note once more. It was clear now Emily had known the danger she was in. But had she feared for her life because of her family's insatiable desire for wealth, or had it been something deeper? Had Minnie truly been in danger from the moment Emily had made her decision? Just then, the sound of footsteps outside the study door broke his concentration. Captain Hastings entered, his face grim. "Poirot," he said in a hushed voice, "I've found something else, something that might be connected to the will." Poirot raised an eyebrow, signaling Hastings to continue. Hastings handed him a small, yellowed envelope. Inside was a letter, written by Emily just days before her death, this time to her lawyer. The letter was brief but alarming. "Please, make sure the will is executed immediately after my passing. I cannot trust anyone in this house anymore." Poirot felt a sense of dread coil in his chest. Emily had known that something was coming, and now it was painfully clear. Someone in this house had a reason to kill her, a reason to destroy the new will before it could take effect. Cliffhanger. Poirot's fingers lingered over the letter, his thoughts racing. Who had killed Emily, and why? Was it the relatives, who stood to lose everything to Minnie? Or was it someone closer to Minnie herself, someone who had been waiting for Emily to slip up, to make one last mistake before the will went into effect? One thing was certain. Emily's death was no accident, and the new will was the key to unlocking the mystery. Poirot was now facing a race against time. Someone would stop at nothing to keep the new will from being revealed, and it was up to him to uncover who and why. Did someone murder Emily to keep her will from becoming official, or was Minnie herself caught in a dangerous game far darker than Poirot could have imagined? The game of secrets and lies had just begun, and Poirot was determined to follow it to its shocking conclusion. Strange clues and twists. It was an old house, its dark, winding halls whispering secrets from long before Emily's death. The grand staircase was the heart of the mansion, but it was also where Emily had met her untimely fall. Despite the hours Poirot had spent examining the scene, something was still off, a sensation that had gnawed at him since his arrival. There was more to Emily's death than met the eye. Poirot stood at the top of the stairs again, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the grand staircase, his mind working in perfect synchrony with the surroundings. His gaze landed on something small, nearly hidden in the shadows beneath the worn wooden railing. A single varnished nail gleamed against the dark wood, so faint, so out of place, his breath caught. "A tripwire," Poirot murmured, his voice soft but filled with conviction. It was a subtle mechanism, one carefully placed to make sure that Emily's fall wasn't an accident. The polished varnish suggested it had been recently installed, a precaution taken to ensure her tumble would appear like a simple misstep. Yet it was clear now someone had orchestrated her fall, someone with a hand so subtle and calculated that even the most astute mind might miss it. Poirot bent down, his gloved hand brushing the nail carefully. The trap had been set, but the question remained. Who had placed it there? Was it someone in the household? Or was it someone more elusive, hiding in the shadows? As Poirot examined the nail, Captain Hastings approached, his face pale and troubled. "Poirot, I think you should hear this," he said quietly, holding up a piece of crumpled paper. Poirot glanced up, intrigued, as Hastings unfolded it. It was a note written in Emily's distinctive handwriting, the ink slightly smudged, as if it had been written in haste. "Bob was outside all night. He couldn't have been the one to push me, but I know now. Someone here wants me dead." The words seemed to pulse with a raw, desperate truth. Emily's fox terrier, Bob, had been outside the house the night of her fall, meaning the dog couldn't have been the one to have caused her to slip, as some had initially believed. But Emily's words revealed something even darker. Her final moments weren't just spent in terror, but in the realization that someone in her household had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Poirot's mind raced. This small note, the varnished nail, the strange behavior of the family members, everything was beginning to fall into place. Emily had suspected that the fall wasn't a mere accident, and now Poirot had proof. But the deeper question haunted him. Who would benefit from her death? Who had been lurking, setting the trap in plain sight? Poirot straightened, his gaze flicking toward the doorway. Hastings was waiting for his verdict, but Poirot remained silent for a long moment. The pieces had shifted. The game was no longer simple. The truth was more complicated, more dangerous than he had imagined. The air in the house seemed to grow heavier, darker. There was no going back now. The investigation had entered a new phase, and Poirot's mind was sharper than ever. Every glance, every conversation, every gesture now carried the weight of suspicion. The killer was still among them. The trap had been set, and Poirot was closing in. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot turned sharply, a new thought piercing his mind like a sharp needle. The tripwire, he muttered, was it intended for Emily, or was it meant for someone else entirely? The question hung in the air like a thick fog. Could it be possible that Emily wasn't the true target? Was there someone else in the household that the murderer wanted to eliminate first, and was Emily's death merely an unfortunate consequence of the killer's mistake? Poirot stepped back, his eyes gleaming with renewed purpose. "Hastings," he said, his voice steady, "we must speak to Minnie Lawson immediately." As Poirot turned, Hastings looked confused but followed, and in that instant, the trap seemed to close tighter around them all. The truth was within reach, but the next twist could prove even deadlier. Who was truly the intended victim of the tripwire? Was Emily's death part of a bigger scheme, or had she been the final target after all? Poirot's eyes narrowed as he thought of Minnie Lawson's peculiar role in all of this. The answers were getting closer, but with each clue, the danger grew ever more real. During the séance, the night had fallen thick and heavy over the mansion, draped in an eerie fog that seemed to crawl up the ancient walls. The air inside the drawing room was no less oppressive, charged with an unsettling energy. It was the perfect night for a séance. The family, desperate for answers and perhaps more willing to believe in the supernatural than Poirot, had gathered around the round table, each of them casting wary glances as they attempted to contact the spirit of the late Emily Arundel. The medium, a woman named Madame Serena, had come highly recommended, though Poirot had never been one to believe in such occult nonsense. His skepticism was well known, and he watched the proceedings with a critical eye, his gaze sharp, studying every movement of the participants. Captain Hastings sat beside him, visibly uneasy, but Poirot gave no sign of his own discomfort. As the séance began, the room plunged into a heavy silence. Madame Serena closed her eyes, her voice rising in a soft chant. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but within the room, there was only the sound of Serena's low murmurs and the occasional creak of the house settling. Poirot remained still, his eyes never leaving the medium. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was about to break the tension in a way that would defy explanation. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped, an unnatural chill spreading through the room. The candles flickered, their light casting long, shuddering shadows. And then, without warning, the witnesses gasped in collective horror. A faint but unmistakable glow seemed to emanate from Emily's chair at the far end of the table. The light was subtle at first, like a soft mist, just at the edge of their vision, but soon it intensified. It began to swirl, almost as if it were alive, dancing and pulsating. The room was filled with a strange, shimmering aura, a luminous mist that hovered around the chair. And then, as if summoned by an invisible force, the glow shifted and seemed to take shape, focusing around the mouth of Emily's chair, where an ethereal light glowed as if drawn from deep within the spirit world itself. The witnesses were frozen, mouths agape in disbelief. Even Captain Hastings, who had tried to keep his composure, had gone pale, his breath shallow and fast. "Monday Dieu," he whispered under his breath. "What is this?" Poirot leaned forward, his mind racing. He had seen many things in his career, but this was new. This was something that even he could not immediately explain. His sharp eyes followed the glow as it danced above the table, mesmerized but also calculating. Could this be some trickery, a clever deception, or was it something more, something beyond the reach of logic? Madame Serena's voice wavered, her words trembling as she spoke. Emily Arundel, can you hear us? Speak to us from the other side." The medium's hands were raised, as though in prayer, as the luminous aura seemed to pulsate stronger, answering her call. Poirot remained unfazed, his mind working at lightning speed. The glow was undoubtedly real, but the question was, what did it mean? Was this truly a supernatural event, or was there a far more rational explanation behind it? Poirot had always placed his trust in science, logic, and observation, and he would not be swayed by appearances. But something gnawed at him, a disturbing thought that refused to let him go. Could there be a scientific explanation that he was overlooking? As the glow continued to pulse and ebb, something caught Poirot's attention. Beneath the mystic light, he noticed a faint shape, the outline of a small, indistinct object. It appeared to be coming from Emily's mouth, as if something was being expelled from her lips, even in death. Poirot's heart raced. Suddenly, the light flickered and vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Silence fell over the room, as though the air had been sucked out of it. The witnesses sat frozen, staring at one another, too stunned to speak. Poirot was the first to break the stillness. "This, my friends," he said, his voice cool and deliberate, though his mind was whirring with possibilities, is not something I have encountered before. He turned to the group, his gaze intense. But do not let your imaginations run wild. There is always an explanation. This aura, as you call it, is but another clue, and I will find the truth behind it. He turned toward Captain Hastings. We need to examine every inch of the room, every item, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Cliffhanger ending. But just as Poirot was about to move forward, a voice faint but clear echoed through the room, its source unclear. Find the ring, the voice whispered, the words hanging in the air like an echo from the beyond. Poirot froze. His mind quickly raced through all the clues he had uncovered so far. The will, the secret messages, the mysterious tripwire, but this was something new. A ring. Could it be the key to unraveling everything? Was the luminous aura a sign of something supernatural, or had Poirot just uncovered another layer of deception? The whispering voice had given him a new lead, but would he be able to decipher it in time to uncover the truth behind Emily's death? And what was this mysterious ring that had been alluded to? The investigation was taking a turn toward the inexplicable, and Poirot was determined to get to the bottom of it. But could his brilliant mind outpace the dangers now closing in around him? The murderer strikes again. The night had descended on the mansion like a heavy blanket, the weight of impending danger hanging in the air. Bella Tanios, her face pale and drawn with fear, had taken a drastic step. Fleeing from her oppressive and dangerous marriage, she had secretly gathered her children and sought refuge in one of the guest rooms. Her hands trembled as she locked the door, her mind racing with the terrifying realization that her life and the lives of her little ones were in grave danger. Her thoughts kept returning to the strange events of the past few days. First, the haunting message she had received, warning her that her life was in jeopardy. Then, Emily's untimely death, which Poirot had insisted was no accident. Bella had heard whispers of a killer among them. But who could it be? Was it the cunning Charles, or the dangerous Teresa? Or worse, could it be someone closer to her, her husband Jacob? In the darkness, she clutched her children tightly, knowing she was vulnerable. Her heart pounded as the night seemed to stretch on endlessly, the oppressive atmosphere thickening around her. She barely slept, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every faint sound outside the room. She could not shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Meanwhile, Poirot, ever vigilant, had moved Emily's timid companion, Miss Minnie Lawson, to a safer location. The quiet woman had no idea of the extent of the danger she was in, but Poirot understood the gravity of the situation. Too many strange occurrences had linked the deaths to those closest to Emily, and now, with Bella's sudden flight from her husband, Poirot feared the worst. With his characteristic precision, Poirot surveyed the mansion, making mental notes of every shift in atmosphere, every flicker of light that felt slightly out of place. Every step he took was cautious, measured, as though he were walking a thin line between revelation and peril. The stakes had escalated. A killer was in their midst, but who? As the hours passed, Poirot couldn't help but feel that the walls were closing in. There was a sense of urgency now. Bella, who had once been a central figure in the family drama, was no longer simply a worried relative. She had become a target. The feeling of impending doom was inescapable. And then, the very next morning, the news came. Bella was dead. The news hit like a bolt of lightning. Poirot, who had spent the night in quiet contemplation, rushed to the guest room where Bella had been staying. The door was unlocked, and inside, the air felt still, too still, as though the very room itself was holding its breath. Bella's lifeless body was sprawled on the floor, her face pale and frozen in an expression of terror. A small glass bottle of sleeping pills was found beside her, the label worn and faded. The family physician, Dr. Granger, was the first to arrive on the scene. His face was grim as he examined the body, confirming that Bella had overdosed on sleeping pills. "It's tragic," he said, his voice heavy with false sympathy. "A case of self-inflicted despair. She must have been under so much stress." But Poirot, standing in the doorway, wasn't convinced. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, noting the details that others missed. Bella had been frightened, yes, but she wasn't the type to end her own life. There had been no indication that she was suicidal, no signs of a mental collapse. The very fact that she had taken such drastic measures to protect her children only hours before made the idea of suicide seem improbable. Poirot's mind churned, piecing together fragments of evidence, piecing together a story that didn't add up. The room was neat, too neat. Bella had been in a hurry, but her actions had been far too deliberate. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of panic. It seemed calculated, as if someone had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. But who? Poirot's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but there was one question that gnawed at him. Why had Bella been targeted? Was she simply in the wrong place, at the wrong time? Or had she uncovered something she wasn't meant to? Poirot bent down and examined the sleeping pills more closely. The bottle had been opened recently, the cap slightly askew, as if someone had tampered with it. This wasn't a suicide, this was murder, made to look like a tragedy. As Poirot stood up, Captain Hastings entered the room, his face ashen with shock. "Do you think it's the same person?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with dread. Poirot's gaze shifted, his expression steely. "We must consider all possibilities, Hastings. Bella knew too much. She was close to the truth, and someone did not want her to live long enough to expose it." Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot stared at Bella's body, something caught his eye, a small, almost imperceptible mark on the underside of the chair. A faint, fresh scratch, as if someone had recently run their fingers across the wood. But there was something strange about it. It was too deliberate, too careful. Was this a clue? Or had the murderer been trying to leave behind a signature, an unsettling reminder of their power? Poirot stood frozen for a moment, his heart racing. This was no random act of violence. The game was changing, and someone in that house had just taken a dangerous leap toward the truth. Who would be next? The final revelation. The grand drawing room was a picture of eerie stillness, a place where secrets had been concealed for years. The high, ornate ceilings seemed to watch over the assembled group, their gleaming chandeliers casting long shadows that twisted unnervingly in the flickering candlelight. It was here that Hercule Poirot had summoned the key players of this sinister drama, the suspects who had unwittingly played their parts in the death of Emily, and now the shocking truth was about to be revealed. Poirot stood at the front of the room, his back straight, his eyes gleaming with quiet confidence. Beside him stood Captain Hastings, his face drawn, still struggling to comprehend the twists of this horrific case. The room was thick with tension as the suspects sat nervously in their chairs. Each one was bracing for the moment that Poirot would reveal the killer among them. The air was pregnant with anticipation. Charles, the charming but desperate nephew, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing nervously at his aunt's ornate portraits on the wall. Teresa, the glamorous yet dangerous niece, fidgeted with the hem of her dress, her lips painted a deep red, a stark contrast to the pale, drained look on her face. Bella's husband, the brooding Jacob Tanios, sat still, his eyes hard, his knuckles white from gripping the armrests. And then there was Miss Minnie Lawson, the unassuming companion, who had been dragged into the web of deceit without her consent. All of them were suspects. All of them had their own motivations. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room, and he began to speak, his voice calm yet filled with quiet intensity. "Monday, amis, you are gathered here today because Emily's death was no accident. You all suspected one another, pointed fingers, but the truth was hidden in plain sight. Allow me to enlighten you." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air, before continuing. "It is not Teresa, it is not Charles, nor even the misunderstood Minnie. The killer was Bella Tanios." A collective gasp filled the room, and the faces of the assembled suspects froze in disbelief. Bella, the woman who had fled from her husband, the one who had been so desperately afraid. It seemed impossible. But Poirot's sharp gaze never wavered, and the revelation began to unfold. Bella, he explained, had lived a life shackled by her cruel, domineering husband, Jacob. Her marriage had been nothing but a prison, a torment that drove her to the edge of despair. But Emily's fortune and the new will had presented her with an opportunity, an escape from the oppression she faced every day. However, when she discovered that Emily had changed her will, leaving everything to Minnie Lawson, Bella panicked. She saw her future slipping away once again. Her marriage to Jacob was a torment she could not bear, and now, with Emily's death, the inheritance would fall into the wrong hands. Minnie's, the meek companion who could never understand what Bella had endured. In her desperation, Bella concocted a devious plan to make Emily's death appear natural, to erase any trace of foul play. She poisoned Emily with elemental phosphorus, a substance so powerful, so insidious, that it mimicked the symptoms of liver disease. It was genius in its simplicity, and for a time it worked. Emily's death appeared to be nothing more than an unfortunate, natural event. But Bella's plan hadn't ended there. The glowing aura that was seen during the séance, that was no ghostly apparition. It was the result of the phosphorus poisoning, a glowing effect that had been described in ancient cases of poisoning with the element. The very thing that had killed Emily had caused the strange, eerie glow that captivated everyone during the séance. Poirot had been fascinated by it, and now he knew that the answer had been right in front of him all along. And yet, Bella's panic had not subsided. Upon discovering the change in the will, Bella's fears reached a boiling point. The inheritance, the very thing she had hoped to control, was slipping further from her grasp. In her desperate bid for freedom, she plotted to kill her husband next. Jacob, the man who had kept her imprisoned for so long, would be her next victim, but fate had other plans. In the midst of her plotting, the guilt, the fear, the pressure had become too much. Bella had made one fatal mistake. In her haste, she had swallowed the very same poison she had intended for Jacob. Her death was not an act of suicide, as some had thought. No, it was an accident, a result of her own twisted design. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he turned to the stunned faces in the room. It was not a crime of passion, but a crime of desperation. Bella Tanios thought she could escape her torment, but in the end, she sealed her own fate. The room was silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of a distant clock, a reminder that time was running out, and the truth had finally been revealed. But Poirot was not finished. As he spoke, his gaze flickered to the family portraits on the wall, the silent witnesses to all the deception. There was something more, something Poirot had been pondering ever since the first twist had emerged. A dark secret still lingered in the shadows of the family's history, one that had yet to come to light. Poirot turned to face the group once more, a gleam of mystery in his eyes. But there is still one question left unanswered. What other secrets lie buried within this family? What truths have been hidden for far too long? The room tensed. The walls themselves seemed to close in, and for the first time in their lives, the suspects realized that the mystery was far from over. What other dark truths lay in wait, ready to be uncovered? Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot left the room, a cold shiver ran down everyone's spine. The case seemed to have been solved, but Poirot's words echoed in their minds. What other secrets were hidden within the family? Could this have been the end, or was there more to uncover? As the room fell into an oppressive silence, a sudden knock echoed from the grand front door, a sound that no one expected to hear at such a late hour. Who could it be? What more could there possibly be to uncover? The aftermath, emotional closure. The sun dipped low behind the distant hills, casting a soft golden glow over the village as Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings stood at the edge of Emily's once grand estate. The air was thick with the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded, the darkness now lifting, yet the emotional scars would never fully fade. Poirot's sharp mind had unraveled every twisted knot of deceit, but the emotional toll on the family, and on the innocents caught in the crossfire, was something not even his meticulous reasoning could erase. Inside Emily's vast, echoing mansion, the will had been read, and the reality of Emily's final wishes began to take shape. Miss Minnie Lawson, the timid companion who had so often been overlooked, now stood in possession of Emily's fortune, but Poirot had ensured that Emily's desires were honored in the most meaningful of ways. The inheritance would be divided, but not as Emily had originally feared. Miss Lawson, despite her quiet nature, had expressed a deep compassion toward the family members, those who had suffered at the hands of Bella's cruelty, those who had been blinded by their own greed. With a heavy heart, many had chosen to share Emily's wealth. Teresa, the glamorous niece, whose reckless lifestyle had been the cause of much of the turmoil, was the first to receive a portion. Despite her outward confidence, Teresa was a woman trapped in her own desperation, and now she would have the means to escape the clutches of her vices. Charles, the charming but broke nephew, who had only ever seen Emily as a source of wealth, was given a smaller portion, a cold reminder of how his self-centered ambitions had led to nothing but ruin. And then there were Bella's children. It was the most difficult decision of all how to deal with the legacy left by a mother whose choices had destroyed so many lives. But Poirot, with his quiet wisdom, had urged Minnie to give them a chance, to let them rebuild their lives outside of their mother's shadow. They were not to blame for Bella's actions, and it was the least that Emily's spirit could hope for. In the dim light of the evening, Poirot sat with Hastings on the steps of the mansion, Bob the fox terrier curled up at their feet, his soft breathing a small comfort in the otherwise still night. Poirot's eyes remained distant, his thoughts far away. Yet the weight of the case hung heavy in his heart. They had solved the mystery, yes. They had unraveled the tangled web of greed and betrayal, but the personal cost had been steep. The family, fractured by ambition, guilt, and loss, would never be the same. "It is often the case, Hastings," Poirot murmured, his voice heavy with sadness, "that greed is the poison that destroys a family. But it is also the thing that blinds them to what truly matters. The real tragedy, mon ami, is not the death of Emily, but the lives that were wasted in pursuit of something as fleeting as money." Hastings nodded quietly, his eyes following Poirot's gaze as it rested on the estate in the distance. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood empty, a cold monument to the things that had gone wrong. A sudden rustle in the trees caught Hastings' attention, and he turned quickly. A shadow had moved near the edge of the property, too quick to be a figment of their imagination. Poirot's sharp gaze flickered over, his hand instinctively tightening around the small leather pouch that always hung at his waist. He had been on edge ever since the case, had concluded something still didn't feel quite right. "Did you see that, Hastings?" Poirot asked, his voice calm but his eyes narrowed, searching the distance. Bob the fox terrier raised his head, sensing the change in the air, his tail wagging nervously. "It's nothing," Hastings replied, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "Just the wind, perhaps." Poirot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood, his movements precise and deliberate, as he studied the silhouette in the shadows. For a moment, the figure appeared to disappear into the trees. Then, as if on cue, it reappeared closer now, just at the edge of the garden. The figure was no longer a distant, blurred shape, but something far more tangible. Hastings stepped forward, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. "Poirot, should we?" Poirot's sharp whisper cut through the growing tension. "No, Hastings. Let us wait, for there is still something hidden here, something we did not uncover, a final truth that lies beyond the reach of the living." Just as Poirot's words hung in the air, the figure turned sharply and vanished into the night, leaving only the faintest echo of movement. Poirot remained silent, his gaze focused, unblinking. Bob the fox terrier, now fully alert, began to bark urgently, snapping Poirot from his trance. Poirot looked down at the dog with an almost imperceptible smile, though his mind was clearly preoccupied. "It is not over yet, Hastings," he said, his voice quieter now. "The truth sometimes is far more elusive than we ever imagine." Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot and Hastings stood frozen in the gathering twilight, a shiver of uncertainty passed through the air, leaving them both with a gnawing sense that their adventure was not quite finished. A figure in the shadows, was it an innocent wanderer, or someone who had returned to finish what had been started? The mystery of Emily's death had been solved, but the last few moments had shaken Poirot to his core. What else had they missed? The chill in the air, the sudden movements in the dark, the sense that something or someone was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. With a final glance at the mansion behind them, Poirot's voice broke the silence, carrying the weight of 1,000 unsolved mysteries. The end, Hastings? I think not. There is still one chapter to be written. As the first star of the evening twinkled faintly above them, it was clear. The case was over, but the story was far from finished.